Hello and welcome to our second SROCfest21 plenary. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce today Mike Ratcliffe, Academic Registrar at Nottingham Trent University. This is a session that we had hoped Mike would deliver for us last year, what would have been SROC 20 at the University of Huddersfield, but we have had to postpone, much to my great disappointment, among other things that we had to postpone last year. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have Mike with us today. So Mike will be talking to us about the hidden history of professional services in higher education. And those of you who know Mike know that he's got an ongoing podcast segment on the Wonkhe podcast called The Hidden History of Higher Education. So if you've heard the podcast already, you know exactly what you're in for. If you haven't heard the podcast before, this is going to be an absolute treat for you, so I really hope you enjoy it. There will be a Q&A. You get to ask questions. We will take the questions at the end of Mike's plenary. So please make sure you add whatever you want during the session, and we'll pick them up towards the end. And without any further delay, allow me to hand over to Mike.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marion. And it is a pleasure to be with you virtually, if sadly not in Huddersfield, because I had been looking forward to the trip to Huddersfield last year. I'd made some very elaborate plans with the absolutely awful state of regional trains to get from Nottingham to Huddersfield, but it's a sadness that I can't actually be there in person. But I'm going to try and run you through the excitement that I think is the professional services in higher education. So I don't know, Sam, are the slides up? Great. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of rattle through this. I'm really looking forward to getting some questions as I go along, but because of the slight limitations with Teams, we'll wrap those up at the end and we'll have a chance to talk about some of those things, and we'll see where we get to. So we're going to have a go through. So let's see where we get to with these slides. So I don't know if it's potentially unfair to pick on our political leaders, but just as a chance, here's a tweet from Michelle Donlan, who very kindly thanked everybody in higher education for all their work. Suddenly that tweet disappeared. I thought, oh no, she's forgotten someone. She's going to put something back again. But it was actually because she'd forgotten the R in the word lecturers, but she'd managed to miss out professional services. And I want to try and put some of that back this afternoon. I want to try and put some of the history of professional services, because sometimes we do seem to vanish from the historical record of our universities. And I want to try and give us a chance to say, well, look, we are there. We were there in the history. We are there throughout our universities, and haven't we made a huge contribution? So those of you who saw the presentation this morning from Tim Thornton, you know, he thanked us all. Marion's thanked everyone who's taken part in the work we've done over the last year. But I think if there's a year in which we've shown that our universities would struggle without our professional services, this is the one. So hopefully we can really get a hang on that and continue to do that work. But professional services is a bit of a new phrase for those of us who still, I suppose, think of ourselves as administrators. But I want to look back and see where we can track those people down, but also to track down what our universities were like before then and how much we can understand that. So one of my favourite bits is the exciting attempt to show how ancient our universities were by adding themselves to the made-up history of England. In the early modern period, people came up with various different theories of how England must have been very, very ancient and very, very linked to the classical world. And the favourite bit is this attempt to describe that it was actually a university set up that had been created under the Trojans, who had arrived in England from the siege of Troy, sailed to the Mediterranean, and had pitched up, and they had provided the opportunity to have a university, and they'd set up a university. And this great book, entirely full of completely fake history. Don't let Michelle Donlan know about that either. It's possible to have fake universities, fake histories. But the idea was that Brutus sailed around and set up a university in Oxford, Greek-clad, Obviously, the slight issue of there not being any Greek ruins in Oxford, so managed to also include the information that the Romans had burnt it down. So not only is Oxford so old that it was set up by the Greeks, it's so old that it was burned down by the Romans. This is, of course, all rubbish. It was no such thing. It came into being through a slow process of accretion, but was mostly going by 1200. But the first university that we understand of in Europe is one that we might want to look at as an example, rather than the Trojans, and that was the university in Bologna. And there were two universities, but they were both for students, and they were the organisations set up by the students who came from out of the city, because citizens had all sorts of powers and ability to work things, but the students who came in were really struggling, and so they set up universities, universitas, which are all the people in the town who did something. And there was one for the people who came from Italy and one for the people who came from outside Italy, and they were a set of organisations that let the university be run by the students. So they were in charge. They elected a rector, and the doctors, i.e. the people who were teaching them, had to swear to follow the regulations of the universities. They had to give leave to the students before they were allowed out, and they had to comply with getting the curriculum taught properly. There's a nice rule here about how they had to ring the bell, and they had to get out in terms. In fact, the students were given the instruction that they had to leave if the lecturer was going on for too long. So that's something you can try later on if I go on for too long with this. Just get up and go. It's your right. It's your university. You're in charge. Sadly, however, that's not quite the model that happened in Oxford and then later in Cambridge. What happened was that it was the masters that the students coalesced around, and the masters became in charge, and the students became very much their subservients. Here is an early picture of what's probably the first purpose-built student accommodation block, certainly in England, which was set up in 1324. So a very long time ago, someone decided it was a good idea to set up a purpose-built student residence and give ourselves the opportunity to run it in this way. And you'll see that it's got shops below, so they would get an income, and then the students would live above, and they were looked after by the master. And the masters gathered together and they wrote the rules, and they imposed the rules on the students. So northern universities became very different to those southern universities, which were scholars' universities, student universities. So we set off in a different path to the universities that exist in southern Europe, and that continues on our way. Now, one of the things that happen is those universities get quite powerful. They work with the king quite a lot, and then they decide that actually it's probably good if they only have two universities. The University of Oxford plays a part in getting rid of the University of Northampton, but both Oxford and Cambridge gather together to get rid of the university that founds itself and sets itself up in Stamford. And here are the rules that people who got the master's degree at Oxford continued to swear until the 19th century. You shall follow the statutes, privileges and customs of the university, but you shan't teach anywhere that is Oxford or Cambridge. And you should particularly not give lectures or hear them read at Stamford. So for the best part of 600 years after they managed to get rid of the University of Stamford, Oxford graduates had to swear never to go and teach there. The ultimate anti-competitive activity by our universities. But our universities sometimes look quite familiar. There was a piece today in the Phil Beatty circulated about universities looking the same from 400 years ago. And in some ways, we do look quite similar. Here are a wonderful set of regulations from Freiburg University. And they look pretty similar to the kind of things we have now. They're a great set of regulations. I enjoy them because they're illustrated. And you see these beautiful illustrations as you go through. But actually, the translations are pretty much as we would find them now. So here is a student being shown around by the president, shown to their room. And obviously, there are some exciting rules about observing complete silence and cleaning your room. One of the things I find most fun about these regulations, though, is the way in which the penalty system is organised. So here, if you're lazy and you don't make your bed, then you'll have your wine removed. And if it happens more frequently, they'll take your bed away. Now, acceptably, you have to understand that wine was obviously a sensible thing you could drink, and therefore it's not necessarily everything you should have. It was just the water you would have, but it's still a punishment based on alcohol, and one sometimes I think might do some good in the contemporary university. Certainly the illustrated regulations would be good to try and explain it to people. But where do we find professional services in all of these medieval universities? Well, not very much around. Mostly it's just the scholars. But there starts to become a process whereby the two universities have privileged persons. So those people who actually are linked to the university, and they matriculate them in the way that they matriculate students, which means they can enjoy the university's privileges, which are quite considerable because it stops you being locked up by the local city authorities. And therefore they add themselves various different things. So barbers and bookbinders and limners and parchmenters and college cooks might be matriculated, looked after by the university, and start to be inside the university themselves. But these universities have emerged themselves. They haven't just been plonked by the government. But our first example of that is when the government of Elizabeth decides that it would be a good idea for Irish people to stop going to France, Italy and Spain to get their education, because there they have become infected with popery and other ill qualities and become evil subjects. So they decided to set up a Protestant university, Trinity College, the University of Dublin, so that the students would stay there and not go overseas and get infected with new ideas. So this idea of the university as a state-controlled opportunity for people to come is an Elizabethan idea. We haven't had that before. It's the beginning of a colonial idea of university, something the English impose on other people. And the next one that they do is a little bit more sorted out by the people nearby. What they want to do is, having schlepped all the way across the North Atlantic, the people who founded Massachusetts want to have a college too. They have a great idea that, by setting up a college, they'll do two things. Firstly, it means that they won't have to send their sons back across the Atlantic, not that enticing a prospect, but it also means that they could keep the religion as they wanted it. And so they were lucky that Mr. Harvard gave them his money and his estate, and so they set up a college, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall lie in the dust. And this extract is from effectively the first alumni mailing asking for money. This is an attempt to write back to England and say, send us money. We're sitting with a great college. Send funds across the Atlantic so we can make our university the best it can be. In England, there's a continued development around religion. After the Civil War, the Act of Uniformity imposes a new approach to universities. Everybody there must join the Church of England. And you'll see this long list of people that have to subscribe to the Church of England. And if they're not, A, they can't teach there. But B, if they go out and try to teach someone, they can be fined and imprisoned for teaching people in the ways if they're in the school. So there's an absolute control over by the Church of England. You're not allowed to join the University of Oxford if you don't subscribe, and you're not allowed to graduate from the University of Cambridge unless you subscribe. Again, that continues for 200 years. The test tax have finally got rid of in the middle of the 19th century. Universities are just for people who subscribe to the Church of England. But other countries start to unpack what that means. One of the most important influences of development of university is the bringing together of a whole series of new ideas in the new University of Berlin. Wilhelm von Humboldt is appointed by the King of Prussia to set up a new university. He's a minister, and as a minister he writes a memorandum setting up what a new university should be, and he decides that it should be for the science and scholarship bringing together. So the idea is that they will work together, so discovery of new knowledge and teaching will happen together, and this potentially is one of the things that sets off the universities in a completely new way, an unceasing process of inquiry coming together for the first time in our new universities. So sometimes the English are quite good at copying people. And so in this case, we decide that actually it seems a bit strange that the capital city, now developing into a major metropolis, doesn't have a university. Attempts to found one in Gresham College haven't really worked. And so they set up a new university in the University of London. And this is its mission statement, its opening thing, written by Thomas Campbell, to the Times, which is a good way of starting a new university. But he writes in saying this is what we should have our university to do. So for those of you who've got responsibility for writing your access and participation statement, perhaps this sentiment isn't going to be quite what you'd use. It's going to be effectively and multifarially teaching, examining and exercising, rewarding with honours and liberal arts the youth of our middling rich people. There's a great exercise that Campbell does with his fellow promoters of the new university, and they work out how many people can walk to Bloomsbury, and that's their market. How many young men can walk to Bloomsbury, get a daily education and then go home again? Because they want to combat the major problem that exists in the existing two universities, which is the residential life has become, let's say, slightly dissolute. Students go away, rack up huge debts, no one knows what they're doing, and all that happens is the parents suddenly get sent a very large bill from the students' university, or from the students' tailors, or from the students' bookmakers. So the idea is you hold your students at home and you can look after them. It also gets around the issue of where they go to church, because if they're at home at the weekend, either on a Friday night or on a Sunday morning, you decide where they go to church. It's up to you to make sure that they're looked after in terms of their morals. You don't need to send them off to somewhere that has a chapel. So UCL, as we now know it, doesn't have religious teaching. It doesn't build a chapel. It gives that opportunity for people to decide what they want to do when they go home for themselves. It's a new thing. People don't like it, of course. It's a godless university, but there's that sense that we might develop it. But again, there's very little sense of where the professional services staff might be in that. New universities are founded around the country, and there's a sense from here in this history of the University of Leeds that at first there was very little need for administrative staff. A local firm of solicitors might provide the kind of backbone work that you want, and then you might have an assistant who would help to run the committees. Early universities are very dominated by committees, and therefore all that you need is a secretary. In time, the academics decide that that's actually a bit troublesome, and so they appoint somebody to look after their committee duties for them. And that's where you start to get a professional service built in those universities, as we start to get people who look after the work of the academics and start to become clerks to senates and look after their boards of faculties. Now, for those of you so extra keen on the opportunities that Data Futures brings you, here is its predecessor, the heads of return set out by the Department for Education, or the Board of Education as it was then. What had happened was that universities had gently asked for funding from the government, and the government had thought, well, that was probably quite a good idea. And so what it did is it started to fund some of the universities or university colleges that had been set up, and in return it wanted to know what they were up to. So it set out for the first time in the beginning of the 19th century, 20th century, the kinds of things that people would pull together. And so there's a long list of things that each of these new institutions had to return. And here are the heads of return. And I've extracted some which might be of interest. So first of all, you had to send in the staff and how much they were paid, which is interesting. But also you had to start to collect together in a tabular form the students. So not an individualized return, but an aggregate return sent in so that you got the brief particulars of students, but also a sense of whether they had a prior education or whether or not they were coming from within a radius of 30 miles or from outside the United Kingdom. And these were bound together to produce a nice document, giving a clear sense for Parliament of what they were funding. Sadly, not as detailed as the great series of HESA books that used to lie in my office, but clearly a sense of where we were going and what was going on. So here's an example. Here's the University of Liverpool's return from 1908-09, and there you can see the headings that they were required to put things under. And University of Liverpool's got going. It's got 600 students on degree courses and 1,100 students in total. And just for fun, because we like to show that we do change in higher education, here's the HESA return data from 2018-19, 110 years later. You have to accept that it's a bit hard for us to compare what the University of Liverpool was doing in 1918-19 because of the impact of the First World War. So if we look 110 years, you get a sense of the difference between those two institutions in its pre-war state and now in the vast institution that it is. Nearly 30,000 students, as opposed to an institution that had barely 1,000 students 110 years before. We do change in higher education, and sometimes we do it quite well. Here's another one, and I could go on all day with these, but here's another one just to entertain. Here's University College Nottingham. It's got that exciting opportunity. It's got 2,363 students, but look, the bulk of those students are evening students. Again, there's an attempt to get adult learning back in the evenings, but these universities were very keen on doing that. I'm intrigued that there's a head of return that Nottingham have included of students not taking courses. Not clear what those 154 students are doing, but they're not taking courses and they add to that sum. And you see the difference here of this university college that only has 211 students taking degree courses. The absolute majority of their students are evening students. Now, of course, this is a university with nearly 25,000 undergraduates, making a university of 33,000 students overall. Again, we can see the scale of the change. But just in case you were thinking that everything was going swimmingly with student data returns 110 years ago, there's a salutary comment in one of the older histories of University College Nottingham about the fate of that 1908-09 return. Here in the college's history is the sad news that they'd had some problems with that return. It turns out, by a misunderstanding made in innocence and good faith, that they returned subjects doing 3 subjects as counting 3 and not 1. The error was spotted by a subordinate, but it was not brought to the registrar's attention, and he did not notice it himself. And so they had asked for a treasury grant of £5,700, which Parliament had approved, but on the basis of inflated numbers. So there had been culpable carelessness in the administration of the college. Now, it turns out that both the registrar and the principal resign as a consequence of this. New people are got, of course, but there we have it. Potentially one of our earliest data returns, and a major issue in the way that it was organised and then covered up afterwards. So these things need to be paid attention to, don't they? Those of us who have responsibility for these things and had them for a while, we have to get them right, don't we? Otherwise, not only will the registrar have to go, but the Vice-Chancellor too. Let's get those data returns right, eh? As universities develop, they start to attract people who are starting to think about how a university might be better organised. And here we can look for a comparison to the American universities, who get bigger than us quicker and start to develop the science of how universities should be organised. And they develop effectively an institutional research capability. This lovely example from Abraham Flexner starts to talk about pedagogies, the ability of people to talk about pedagogy in an impenetrable way. And he complains in an otherwise quite interesting book about the way that someone had done all of this work, pages of tables, percentages, graphs, bibliography, all of which were common sense and could have been done without. But there's a sign here in the 20s that people are starting to think about how to organise their university and how to make it work. But sometimes we get these lovely comments, don't we, that universities are all about to go to the dogs, an avalanche is about to come and sweep us away because after all, the world is going to change. One of the things that made people very worried about the future of the universities was radio. Here is Professor Grant talking about the prospect that might be. Someday the professor may be eliminated and his place taken by a loudspeaker symbolically robed in cap and gown, but I think not. The one thing that counts is that education is the impact of mind on mind. The event of the printing did not eliminate the teacher and the lecture, and there's little probability that the less important inventions of our own era, i.e. radio, will have that result. We've seen off television, we've seen off the internet, we'll probably see off Teams. If we're planning to go back, it'll be the impact of mind on mind that'll be back in those classrooms, hopefully as soon as possible for as many of our students as possible. Here's the development of the major administrative work of the University of Leeds. Those of you who've had responsibility for calendars will know that they're quite good ways of collecting a lot of information together. This is how the University of Leeds was ticking along in 1939, just before the outbreak of the Second World War. And you can see that it managed to get by with a very small central university staff. There are people in the department, superintendents of laboratories and occasional clerks in departments, but basically the centre of the university is run from about 25 people. That's all you need to run a university. Some of the job titles clearly may have changed. I'm not sure that we need a superintendent of women cleaners, or that the university refectory manageress is quite what we're looking for, but clearly those roles are there. We start to see a professional services, tiny but still developing. After the Second World War, there is a sense that we need to expand quickly. The Americans do this by having the GI Bill, which provides students with money to go, and we change our own view too. We provide grants for the first time, and the university's grants committee decides it would be a good idea to found more universities. The process by which they did this, which was one of the segments on the Wonkhe podcast last week, is a lovely moment. What happens is that we decide to plonk these universities around the town, mostly because people write in, and if they write in a convincing way, they get a university. So the people of Blackpool had been doing quite a good job to get their university, but in the end, Lancashire County Council decides on Lancaster instead. They get a site at Bailrigg and off they go. Blackpool never gets its university. Stanford doesn't get a university either. Stanford's university is put together its bid by a businessman who happens to be driving past. He goes from Sheffield to Cambridge, Cambridge to Sheffield. He drives past Stanford all the time. He gets a bypass. He thinks it'd be a good place to university, and he ends up chairing the committee in Stanford to try and get a university. But they're a little bit too late, and they don't get their university. UGC sets up different universities in different places. It balances along quite nicely, and that's what we get, that sense of the universities together. As we expand, we also expand the administration. So these four pictured here are the beginnings of what becomes the AUA. They're a meeting of university administrators. They're all at Manchester together, administratively bright young graduates. They were able, sociable, enjoyed discussions, and could hold their own with academic colleagues. They knew a lot about the place and wanted to find out more. And when they moved out into the higher education sector, they decided to go with a good idea to go and meet each other and find out what each other were doing. So they had a meeting to do that. So from the early 60s, they would go around and discover what was going on in other places. And as these bright graduates went out and populated the new universities, they brought with them an ethos of professionalism of their universities. And they spread a sense. Now, obviously, you can look at them, they're all white blokes wearing ties. But in turn, there's a sense of cooperativeness amongst our university administrators. We start to work together on things. Sometimes it's the challenges that make us work together. So we've got that opportunity to work as computers come along. There's a lovely book, The Managerial Revolution in Higher Education from America, which talks about some of these challenges. Here, there's an issue of what to do with the computer that you get. Except to the largest universities, it's doubtful that a single administrative office, such as the registry, could generate enough work to keep a medium-sized computer fully employed. And since computers can cost around $250,000, the university can scarcely afford to have such an expensive piece of equipment lie idle for many hours of the day. What Rourke and Brooks find then is that the computer becomes an organising principle. You need to give it work, and therefore you start to accumulate all the work together so that you can give it to the computer, which means you centralise your timetabling. It means you put all your student records in one place, you organise it so that you can feed it into the computer, and therefore we start to develop these central systems. British universities buy their computers too. Sometimes it's a question of whether you can get the research computer to do your admin work on the side, but the computerized campus becomes a theme as we move forward. But that also means that we get some managerial zealousness, and newer techniques of management start to move into universities. And again, Rourke and Brooks complain that the zeal for the new science of management will have to be tempered by a concern for maintaining a lively intellectual atmosphere, so that the students or the faculty, academic staff, are in a constant state of incipient revolt against the confining restrictions of a bureaucratic campus. Who could have thought of such a thing? It's a surprise, isn't it, that the change to the research assessment framework today billed by the government is an attempt to deal with bureaucracy. We only use that word when we want to make things sound bad. Perhaps the best way of organising research infrastructure in this country couldn't be a bureaucracy. It could be a better way of organising it. But there we are, the bureaucratic campus, something to rail against. So where do we get to? We start to get a sense of how that sector's developed. So by 1970, the sector has grown 2,830 administrators spread around the place. Now, before HESA decided not to include admin staff, I bet you can go find a couple of large universities who are getting on for that kind of number themselves. The sector has grown, our universities have grown to it, and so has the academic administration. You can find people still complaining about this. There's a nice man, that sounds very patronising, doesn't it? Peter Oppenheimer is an emeritus student, i.e. fellow at Christchurch, and he writes long and very combative things in Oxford Magazine, saying how many administrators there are and how they're all unnecessary. But I think there's plenty of us, and there's a sense that we should be organised and thinking about how we do. I think it works. So who are the people who ended up in those administrative functions? Well, this is an article from the early 70s looking at how people ended up in those roles. There's no specific entrance requirement, but a university degree is expected, and you might have to have a good honours degree. There's no organised in-service training yet, no examinations, but once you're in, you get regulated. But here we get this interesting divide that particularly affects the old side of the sector, that divide between administrators and clerks. The administrators are graduates, and it turns out mostly men, and the clerks are less male, and therefore you get into this divide between them. So you start to get a split between these groups. In old universities, that means that you join a different trade union, something that still happens. You join a different pension scheme, and at its worst, one of you gets to go to the senior common room, and the other one gets to go to the staff club. We build in a divide to our sector. Thankfully, most of those things have now gone, but it's still there in terms of some of those links across the sector. So what should we do with those things? The clerical staff who are doing shorthand typing, bookkeeping or programming, and they are providing a service to everybody. And some of those staff might be able to get through, but promotion to full administrative status is rare. Men are usually appointed to administrative posts and clerical staff are usually women. And therefore, again, just stressing that link, clerical staff are like technicians and join trade unions. The AUT, didn't see itself as a trade union, it saw itself as a professional association. And here is a great thing in terms of why you would want to be a registrar. Why would you want to aspire to this? You rank with a professor. You command a cash salary higher than that of an MP or a bishop. There's no profit motive, and there's no rule, no party politics. One deals with educated people. Social advantages include those senior common rooms, libraries, and sometimes much more. It's not entirely clear what much more is. Is that euphemism left handing for us? But there we are. Registrars can enjoy much more in terms of their social advantages. The bad news for the university, or the good news for the administrative staff, is these posts are tenable up to the age for retirement, and you can only be got rid of because you've got the same kind of procedures as academic staff if you are quite inefficient, intolerably temperamental, or flagrantly immoral, and then you might have that prospect of being dismissed. I think our HR processes have moved on. But again, part of the requirements, part of the excitement of being able to stay on with these jobs. But there is another part to our sector. If the old universities, the autonomy side of the sector is sitting there, we've also developed a part of the sector that comes from local authorities, polytechnics and colleges. And here things are slightly different. So here, the Vice-Chancellor is a director, and they are looking after the university in a different way. I'm not sure I've ever come across a director of a polytechnic or a vice-chancellor on the new university side who is quite the same as a monarch in Tudor or early Stuart England, but we are slightly different. We are slightly more managed on our side of the sector, and potentially that's what Jones and Kelo were alluding to there. But we come from a slightly different background as well. Because we were looked after by local authorities, there are differences. Again, just like that difference between clerical and admin in the old universities, we're in different pension schemes, local government pension schemes. We join different trade unions. we organised ourselves in different ways. And that continued right up to the point where the universities, what became the new universities, were broken off in the 80s to become separate corporations, but often continued to keep their payroll with the local authority. I certainly remember arriving and discovering when I was appointed at Polytechnic that my pay came through the county council and everything was organised on that basis. It's only that we've slowly become autonomous in terms of how we do things on the new university side. But there are still things that are very similar. Universities tend to be built around committees, or at least they used to. And this sense was that this is where the power lay, sitting to the right of the chair, no formal voice, no power, but lots of influence. I certainly remember committees where the staff weren't even listed. They weren't really present, but they did all the work and made things happen. They didn't really spoken to unless they were spoken to, but they were the people who made sure that the outcome was done and provided the record. Here's Ian McNay, slightly chiding us for that kind of work in terms of making things happen. But when did the Halcyon regime end? When was all of this swept away? And I've titled this The Aftermath of Jarrett, but I think it's a coming period in the 80s where the sector changed and we moved on into a different way. And here, for those of us struggling with the world changing quite a lot, in 1980, 1981, major cuts came to our universities. Government decided just to reduce the amount of money it was spending, and therefore the UGC, the body that looked after universities, had to make those cuts. And it decided what it would do was reduce the amount of students rather than reducing the amount of money per student. Not tenable in the end, but it certainly meant that they had to close courses and whole departments in order to do that. They made the money go round, probably grotesquely unfairly. If you're from the University of Salford or Aston, you might still actually feel keenly the cuts that came in the early 80s. It certainly made a major difference to universities, but it kept the sector together, certainly on the university side, but they had to adjust to contraction. It's the first time that it had to happen. It's easy to manage a university while it's expanding. Contracting takes administration, organising, sorting things out, and that accentuated the power of the university to take decisions across the things. It had to sort things out, had to deal with things, and that brought into play the way that universities were organised. The CVCP, the forerunner of the Universities UK, organised a committee, a steering committee for efficiency studies under Alex Jarrett, and these are the kinds of questions that it wanted to do. So a university that needs to understand what it wants to do needs to have a plan. It needs to organise things, and it needs to pay rigorous and systematic attention to the quality of its resource allocation and monitoring procedures. Universities were accused of wasting resources. There was a sense that they were not giving the best value for money. It's interesting to see these terms used, and here we are, the best part of 35 years later, still dealing with some of these kind of issues. Are we giving the best value of money? Are we the best organised? Certainly a concern from the mid-80s. Any attempt that the universities had to say, no, we know what we're doing, was soon punctured, however. The University of Cardiff, or University College Cardiff as it was then, got itself into some trouble. It stopped paying attention to the deficits that were building up. University management wasn't being dealing with the problems, hoping that it will go away and that someone would come and bail them out. And the government took a very dim view of that. You probably can't see the detail in this letter, but it's a lovely letter from the Welsh office complaining bitterly to the Prime Minister that A, they don't have the money to sort out Cardiff, but something has to happen, because if all the students are turned away from the university, they would have a major problem in the election. They'd lose seats. So something must be done. They must sort things out. The government decides to sort it out, and Mike Shattuck is the person who's sent in to sort it out, and he's very restrained account in his book. The UGC and the management of British universities covers this, but there's a sense that they need to sort it out. There's also a letter on file from the UGC to the president of the college, the chair of the council, effectively telling him he has to fire the principal of the college. Things have to be done. The university has to sort out. But as Shattuck notes here, it raised serious questions about the institutional management of the institution. we couldn't pretend that we didn't have some challenges. And so we had to sort things out. We had to move on and deliver things. So the next stage on that route is the end of the binary line, the division between universities and colleges. And here I'd like to draw to your attention this memo, written on the 22nd of March 1991. So 30th anniversary before we get to tomorrow's anniversary of lockdown. But here we are at the anniversary of effectively the civil service deciding we could go ahead with ending the binary line, but only if we put into place some conditions. Firstly, we need to be careful that there has to be one single funding council. It has to work together across the whole of the institutions. It has to have enhanced systems for dealing with quality assurance. There were quite a lot of concerns about quality assurance in both the old and the new universities as they became, but particularly that they had to stop a thing called academic drift, which is polytechnics taking on university status, shifting their course mix to favour more academic subjects. Sternly, Barry Potter notes that this would not be in the wider interests of the economy. More vocational education is needed, not more academic courses. Again, you can see 30 years ago, we're still dealing with some of these issues, still dealing with this preconception from government about exactly what university should do. But there we are, 30 years ago today, the end of the binary line starts. Legislation comes in and it will mark it in next year that it's 30 years, but no doubt people will still bang on about how we need to bring back polytechnics, even though most of our students weren't born when the polytechnics was gone, and they're probably now at the stage where we're going to have second generations of people who will have arrived after their university graduate parents have sent them off. We've moved on 30 years, but the debate sometimes hasn't. I'm going to start to wrap up and talk about some of the things that happened around that, and the fact that we do come up with ideas of how we should manage ourselves. Tommy Geddes was a great boss to work for, but he did get very excited about TQM, and sometimes we have these kind of moves into the sector. Here we have a clear sense that we will have the directorate serving everybody. Students are the customers at the top, and we will have an inverted pyramid, but everybody must get behind TQM. Bless him, Tommy never quite got everyone behind TQM at the institution he moved on to, but he did have a good go at EFQM later on as well. Sometimes we bring these things in, and I'm going to leave you with a recommendation for a book that I think is worth picking up on. Here we have Birnbaum's Management Fads in Higher Education. Sometimes it's vicious about higher education, but actually most of the time it's quite gentle about the things we do. Management has negative overtones. We use the professional and general administration, but actually we need to be paying attention, don't we? Effective leaders cannot be indifferent to the means, and effective managers must have a clear sense of where they want to go to and why. We need to do that as a university. Management fads may come and go, and Birnbaum is marvellous at charting all of these, and no doubt it's now at least 10 years since he wrote that book. We've been through some more in the meantime, but at the heart, universities are trying to organise themselves in the best way, and at the heart of that is professional services stuff. And so, just as we get to the end, we get lovely, where I think one of the things we do best is we collaborate, we work together, we try and source ideas. I went and looked at the JISC archive. I was saddened to discover it doesn't go back beyond 1988, but there I find one of those little notes that we write around the sector. What's going on? This person, registrar, says. Is there a conspiracy? Why is HEFCE doing this? What's happening with MASN? How is this organising? And we are in these times trying to find out the same answers. So here, I think this must have been in the summer. Here is the august members of the Academic Registrars Council also struggling with exactly the same things. Unfathomable in 2000 that we could all be just video calling each other, but there we are. We're trying to work things out together as a sector. I think that's the heart of what we do best in professional services. I'd like to celebrate that and talk about how we do that. But hopefully we can pick that up. And if you've got any questions, that'd be great. And we can see whether we can continue that conversation. But I think it's fun, isn't it? All of the things we've been in the past and how we'll continue to develop. But I think it'd be nice to put a bit more back in our histories, a bit more understanding about where the professional services were, the kind of roles that they played and the roles that we continue to play today. And that's me.
Mike, we've been blown away. I think there's been a lot of chat going on the teams on Twitter and privately as well, because I think you've told us some very interesting things. I think we're all very happy to discover that some of our jobs go back more than 100 years. Certainly, I was not expecting that to be HISA returns. I thought for sure it would have been something else, but apparently so. So that's quite fascinating in itself. Honestly, I don't know where to start with. We do have some questions, but I'm gonna call privilege, because I can't actually type my questions in the Q&A and ask you a question directly. And that's, I've always been fascinated by the job title itself of registrar. Registrar, system registrar, academic registrar, and all of the different iterations of that role. And actually, I find it really interesting that in the US, a registrar is still a very specific thing. So a registrar is a head of registry, that's what they are. So you're talking about registrars, that's what you mean, but it's also a term that's used for the people who work in a registry. So you're a registrar if you work in a registry, or you're a head of registry if you're a registrar. And I've always been interested in how we've ended up with all these different uses of that job title in the UK, where they mean completely different things. And I don't know if you have an answer for me or not.
I think there is a diversity, isn't it? I mean, I think there's one of the issues, and you find yourself doing this anytime this comes up, is that we are a bit Oxford dominated. You know, there is 600 years where they're left alone in England just to run themselves, and they have officers who are the registrar of the university, or the registrari if you're Cambridge. I never really got to the bottom of why they get extra AR at the end for them, but they have that sense of having an officer of the university who looks after the books, who looks after the list of people. And I think that's just one of those things that it slowly accreted those things around. There's a lovely split in the way some universities develop in the 20th century, where they split into the bursars department and the registrars department. And they're completely separate organisations, reporting to the bursar who looks after the money and the registrar who looks after the academic side of things. And I think we've just stuck with those. And people like to either react against them by getting rid of them. Never get rid of your academic registrar; it's a terrible idea. Always have those kind of roles, but I think there's that you know, we've hung on to some of those things, haven't we? That on the academic side, at the heart of it, keeping the list of the students really matters, and knowing who's here and knowing what they're doing, mostly because of the degrees we award to them and the membership that comes for it. But I think that's the classy art side of things, isn't it? Apologies to those of you who might be on the bursar side of things, but that's the classy side of things. That's where we keep the lists and we know what's going on.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to go through some of the questions. Some of them are just comments, they're not actually questions. So someone said, infected with pottery. Excellent, decent chortle there. First question is, what can the history of professional services tell us about their future?
Well, I think it tells us that we're adaptive, aren't we? That we started by being kind of amateur, that it was something that an academic could turn his hand to, his particularly, that they could just do on the side. And I think we've developed that sense that there is a professionalism. The history of AUA, you know, written in this tome, this old book of the Conference of University Administrators, shows that there is a development, that professionalism starts to come in, that having someone who really wants to do this as a job and not just something that they're filling in time to do, I think that really kicks on. And I think that's one of those things, that becoming that professional, understanding the purpose of our institution and helping it to deliver it. I think the thing that we found most interesting over this last year is that we've looked at the skills that our professional services staff have rather than their experience or the patch that they're in. And we found that people have been just magnificent in all sorts of different institutional roles that we didn't think we needed. And actually people have got the skills that they can work across the place. I mean, we would have floundered without our events people, because they have just had such a great set of skills that they can run across the institution. So I think that kind of concentration on the kind of skills and attitudes that people have, I think it's been great. And I think we'll continue to show that people who bring different things, who can organise things, make things happen, sort stuff out, what a great set of skills that we've showcased over the last year.
Thanks, Mike. Next comment rather than question is, quote, less mail, end quote, is a phrase I'm going to use in the future. Next question, as registrar, what social advantages have you enjoyed that fall under the category of much more?
Well, I can hear her rustling around in the next room. I met my life partner through being an academic registrar. You know, the quality assurance was useful. You get to meet people across an institution. I think there's a great thing, isn't it? I mean, I think they're demanding, challenging, wonderful places to work in universities, and I think, you know, if nothing else, there's that constant challenge of working with, you know, what did it say? Working amongst the educated. I think that's just great. I think it brings so much, and you know, the daily challenge is one that I relish, and I think you know, that's one of the things that makes it such a great job, isn't it?
Question: which Tudor monarch would you compare our current crop of VCs to? It's a bit harsh on VCs.
It's very harsh on VCs. I know sometimes you think, well, it's all a bit Edward VI, isn't it? That, you know, they're a bit buffeted by what's going on. You know, they're waiting to find out what's going to happen next. I think that, you know, slave to whatever fortune's coming along or who's going to tell them what to do. Sometimes, you know, there's magnificent vice chancellors striding around like Elizabeth, being very organised and inspirational. I don't know. That's probably the best political answer I can come up with at short notice, Marion.
I like it. I'm gonna suggest next time that our VC is a bit Elizabeth and see how she takes it. Question: are most institutions now structured the same with their professional services? Are any institutions structured very differently?
Well, again, I think one of the things that I'm guilty of sometimes is just assuming that everyone is like the universities I work in, you know, big universities with sometimes a unified structure underneath a chief operating officer, but sometimes not. Sometimes much more of a different kind of variety of things. But then we have tiny places. We have really small institutions, and you know, one of the challenges is that how can we think that you know, when the OFS tells us to all go off and do something, actually there's a lot of very different structures out there, aren't there? There's lots of people trying to do it on very tiny organizations. You watch, you know, new startup institutions trying different things to do. I think that's interesting. I mean, one of the things is we model ourselves around what has to happen externally. You all have to have somebody who spends a bit of their time trying to understand what the OFS wants. You all have to have somebody who spends a bit of their time understanding the money and how it's accounted for in the best way. You all need somebody to look after the students. I think you end up slowly moving to a model which creates that as a set of specialisms, because we can't be generalists across all of those different fronts anymore. The time when, you know, the university leads had 25 people running its administration. They didn't have any counsellors. They didn't have any student services people. You know, the person who did that returned to the Board of Education, wasn't busy with it all day long. We've become big, complicated institutions. There's probably a differentiation of labour that's important, and technology is such an important part of it. You know, the ability to do things with different parts of the technology has become more specialised. I think we've become more separated off in our different functions as that has developed.
Next, there's two similar questions actually, and that's around the number of admin staff and whether you think that number is going to go up or down in the future, taking into account changes in technology, but also changes in requirements.
So one of the things you do when you discover you've only got 45 minutes, 50 minutes to talk about the whole of professional services, all the things you leave out. So Celia Whitchurch's stuff on blended professionals, the kind of para academic, I think is really interesting in terms of the kinds of things we now have to support our institution. Again, jobs that we never understood that we would need, learning technologists and the kinds of people who do a whole raft of things that support learning, but also on the research side. I mean, it was a cheap gag to have a go at this attempt to deal with research bureaucracy, but the things you need to support world-class research administration are big and important, and you don't want your academic leaders, the people who can come up with the answers, dealing with that stuff. You will want to have things. I don't think it'll be radically different. I think there will be, yes, some things could be got rid of. Yes, some things will need to be done, but I think there's still going to be a raft of things. I mean, who knew that we could just point everything at Teams and make it work? But actually, it needed quite a lot of digital technology people. And sometimes when you talk to people from smaller institutions, just the struggle to keep up with all of that, I think it has felt more comfortable in a big institution where we have more specialists who can deal with that. And I think, sometimes you think, well, I don't know how some places will have got on with that. I'm sure lots of people will come back with counterexamples, so they're just as nimble. But I think there's going to be an infrastructure, and there are lots of workload studies about how people are going to train the next generation of academics, but they're scarcer than us, bless them. And we need to be able to support them and students in a different kind of a way.
And since you mentioned academics, there's a question about the division between academic and professional services colleagues these days, and whether you think that division is lessening, or whether you think it's staying the same. And actually, you mentioned the clerical versus administrative earlier, which was interesting, because I think maybe that divide potentially doesn't really exist anymore. But you didn't mention the divide between academic and admin as much.
Yeah, no, I've come clean about how long I've been knocking around the sector a bit in terms of some of the things. All of you who can show emails from 21 years ago can revel in this as well. I've been to plenty of sessions on that distinction between academics and support staff, or professional services staff, or admin, or God help us, non-academic staff. And I think there are different roles that we play in universities. I think the divide is less. Now that's because I've tended to be on the side of the sector where that divide is less. Where I've dipped my toe into the old universities, you can see there's a bit more of that. There's a bit more of, well, you couldn't possibly send an administrative member of staff to a committee, but a school could be represented by anybody now. Your comments will be recorded, whether you're an admin member of staff or an academic member of staff. I think a lot of that stuff has gone because we are all working together in the university, and I certainly don't see that where I am at the moment at NTU. We're people in the university working on our different roles, and there is no them and us. Well, it's not how it was 30 years ago.
We've got from Mike Picken, I hope I've pronounced this right, Mike, who says, I was an administrator in the police sector from 79 onwards. During the 1980s, professional services in police were very much advanced through the growth of professional networks with a multitude of acronyms: COPS, PFOG, PAOG, and most importantly, APA. Eventually, SROC came along in the early 90s. 86 was Baby SROC. John Pratt's book on the history of polytechnics pays homage to these. How important do you think these groups were in instigating and strengthening the culture of present-day universities?
Yeah, so when I was doing my work, I thought I'll get out my inch thing. Somewhere I've got my APA membership card, and I think Mike's right, and if you plumb the depths of those admin student databases, you'll find Mike's name all over them, and admin planning too. I think that's part of the things that we've used to develop a professional sense. We really do have an overall identity, and I think we've solved things together as a sector, working collaboratively. It was a bit of an afterthought at the end, but I think that's actually been one of the strengths of the sector is how we've worked on things together. And if we are competitor institutions, it's never shown in the kinds of discussions we've had as a sector together. Occasionally you might hold your powder dry on your next marketing campaign or your next exciting wheeze of how you might get rid of the prospectus this year, but actually most of the time we've been very open and developing things and made huge strides together as a sector. Working parties full of administrators have changed so many different things. And yeah, I think, you know, that chart of how we've done things is important. I was going to try and come up with all the different acronyms of all the different organizations and how they've, you know, developed and changed, but it defeated me on a PowerPoint slide because there's just so many of them, so many logos to show together. But I think it's part of what we've been, haven't we? Our academic colleagues work together in their disciplines. I think we work together in our different ways across the sector. You know, SROC at 30 is part of that. You know, AUA will celebrate its 60th. You know, we have been working together for, you know, longer than any of us have been in the sector. None of us can pretend. I did meet James Walsh, you know, one of those people in that picture. He was the registrar at the university that I was a student at. So there is a hand down from that generation of people who work together on things across the sector.
Mike, I'm going to end there. We have got a couple of more questions, but we've reached our time. I just want to say that there's also a lot of comments here saying thank you very much for a fascinating session. And I just want to echo those comments as well. So thank you very much for joining us at SROC this year.
That's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.